So with our recording started, I want to just formally welcome everyone to our webinar today. I'm Sara Saltee. I'm the Director of Leadership and Learning Programs at the Center for Partnership Studies. And I want to welcome all of you on behalf of the Center to this continuation of an important conversation at the intersection of social justice, domestic violence, and faith. I want to share a regret from the Center that Riane Eisler is suffering with some laryngitis today and will not be able to join this conversation. I will not be standing in for Riane, but attempting to sort of share some of the Center for Partnership Studies perspective on some of the questions as we go forward. But Riane is with us in spirit and sends her love and admiration to Julie and Ron, and we'll be sure that her voice is very much present in the follow-up materials that all of you will have access to after the webinar today. We also will not be joined by Renita Robinson, who was to be our moderator today. She also unfortunately had a last-minute event come up that prevented her from being with us. So I will be moderating the event today, and I look forward to our conversation with Julie and Ron. So before we get going, I also want to acknowledge and thank our co-sponsors for this event. These are all organizations. Many of you here as participants are here representing these organizations, and we really appreciate all that you've done to help us get the word out about this webinar and to really step up and put your names to the important conversations that are happening in this series. We really appreciate all of your support and efforts around promotion and being with us in this endeavor. So thank you very, very much. So I'm going to actually get out of our slides now so we can focus more on our panelists today. So as many of you know, this is the second in a pair of webinars exploring the relationships between traditions of domination, traditions of violence, and our faith traditions, and exploring how we can shift away from that history of domination and toward a culture of partnership, equality, and nonviolence. If you were with us for the first webinar on May 22nd, welcome back. We look forward to deepening the conversation that started in May with you today. And if you're just joining the conversation for the first time today, thank you so much for being with us. We know you'll have no trouble diving right in. So we are delighted to continue that conversation with our wonderful panelists. And I'm going to introduce Riane for those of you who aren't familiar with her, although she can't be with us in person. Her work is very much at the heart of how we've conceptualized the framework for this conversation. Riane is, as many of you are aware, internationally known for her work to reveal the deep historical and cultural foundations of misogyny and violence, expressed in books such as The Chalice and the Blade, Sacred Pleasure, and more recently, The Real Wealth of Nations, Toward a Caring Economics. Riane is also the president and founder of the Center for Partnership Studies. We also are joined by Julie Owens. Hi, Julie. Who what's that?
I said, hi, everyone.
Julie is a groundbreaking trainer in the field of domestic violence prevention and victim advocacy. And we're joined also by Ron Clark. Welcome, Ron, who is a church planter and minister in Portland, Oregon's Agape Church of Christ. Ron is the author of Freeing the Oppressed and the developer of innovative approaches to enrolling clergy people as effective advocates for those who are victimized or oppressed.
Good afternoon.
So in the first webinar, and many of you have tuned into that either by being present there or by watching the recording of that event, but I thought I'd just situate us quickly in some of the broad themes that we talked about in that first webinar, and then share with you how we're going to unfold today's events from there. So the broad themes of the first webinar really the idea of situating the issues of domestic violence and intimate violence, family violence, in the broad context of our human history and cultural traditions, including the ways in which religious traditions and religious institutions have played a role in perpetuating gender inequality and violence. Riane Eisler helped us to see that our individual experiences of domestic violence are really part of a broader legacy of a social configuration she calls the domination system. And in the domination system, gender inequality is actually a core value. And violence is an accepted way of upholding rigid hierarchies of power, not only between men and women, but between all groups considered superior and those considered inferior. She helped us to see how domination systems work at all levels of society, from our intimate relations within our families and our love relationships, to our laws, our systems of governance, and yes, the stories we tell and the beliefs we uphold through our religious traditions. We also talked about the work being done today to bring forward those aspects of our faith traditions which are grounded in a different way of organizing human societies, a way that Dr. Eisler calls the partnership system. We discussed how all scriptures contain teachings about mutual respect, peace, love, and deep regard for the other. And Ron Clark and Julie Owens shared stories and examples of ways that these threads from religious teachings can be woven into a new framework for not only supporting individual victims of domestic violence within faith communities, but also reshaping how faith communities understand their role as active advocates for healthy partnership relations between all people. And as that conversation unfolded in May, the participants, many of you who are back with us today, peppered us with a large number of wonderful, thoughtful, insightful questions. And we left feeling that we weren't really done with all that there was to say on these important themes and topics. So today we're going to spend the first chunk of our time together in conversation with our panelists, digging deeper into those themes by responding directly to the questions that you raised in the previous webinar and some that we received after the webinar by email of people writing in to share additional questions. And then we'll take some time toward the end to take a look at the additional questions that are popping up or comments that are popping up in the chat today, so that we continue to build the dialogue with those of you here present today. And then after the session today, you'll all receive a follow-up email, including a link to this, to the recording of this session, and many other resources that we've begun to gather for you to help you take what you're learning today here and put it into action in your own worlds and your own work. So with that background, let me just share that we took the questions that you asked in the first webinar and clustered them around sort of 7 broad topics that seem to really be at the forefront of what was on your minds as attendees, participants in these events. And the first of those, I think we'll start with really the broad question about what is the importance of looking at domestic violence through a social justice lens, which is really quite different from the mental health lens that many of us are oriented toward. And specifically, I want to share two questions, one from Phyllis Frank, who says, so many of us are trained to see violence and abuse as a mental health rather than a social justice issue. So many therapists offer a wide range of treatments, but do not share the social justice analysis. Can you speak to the importance of the social justice frame? And what does it show that the mental health paradigm misses? And from Dr. T.A. Bashir, how do poverty, unemployment, and substance abuse intersect with domestic violence? I want to just say first from Riane Eisler's notes that the big picture here that she would emphasize, I think, is that the social justice frame really helps us to see the social roots of violence, helps us to see the broader patterns underlying violence in our culture, and really takes us out of the individualistic view, as important as that is for our healing work, but helps us to really ask what or who do we systematically value and support in our society, and what and who do we systematically render silent or invisible. And so it's really that bigger frame that helps us to connect the dots between some of the different issues that can seem separate, but are really part of these broader patterns. Julie, I want to invite you to chime in here as well on this big question about sort of the importance of the social justice frame, and then Ron, please chime in as well.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you. Thank you for that question, those of you who ask. And Phyllis Frank, I know you work with abusers, and so I think it's really important for victims and for abusers that we talk about the intersections that have influenced them and the experiences that have determined really their position in society, which influences whether or not they experience violence to some degree, and certainly how they respond to it to another degree. Of course, my work is with victims, and so most of what I know is around that. But having many years ago, about 17 years ago, been the director, the domestic violence director for the big mental health authority here where I live, I had the opportunity to do a lot of work with mental health clinicians, and my background had been in working in PTSD, substance abuse, and so forth as it relates to violence. And I do think that when we see individuals who have multiple vulnerabilities like substance use or maybe pre-existing mental health concerns or even trauma reactions, that a lot of times we focus on that and we attach a causation to it, so that we think, oh, the reason this person's being abused or the reason he's abusing is because he's sick or he can't help it or he's got this diagnosis. And I've spent a lot of time talking with victims about this too, because I think a lot of times victims, because we don't understand, why is he doing this? Why does he do it sometimes but not all the time? Why does he do it now but not before we married? You know, how do we attach meaning to that and explain that? And a lot of times, you know, mental health becomes the answer. I think we see that a lot here in the US with the mass shootings. A lot of talk about mental health, and yet we know that most of those mass shootings don't happen, aren't perpetrated by someone with a history of a lot of mental illness, as far as we know. And by the way, there is a connection to domestic violence with mass shootings almost every time. So, you know, what we call intersectionality is really critical, because these statuses that we have in life, our gender, our race, our ethnicity, our religion, our age, our income, our sexual orientation, all of these things influence us in how we experience things in life. And so if you have someone who is experiencing multiple kinds of discrimination, I mean, most victims of domestic violence are women, not all of us, but say, for example, those who are LGBTQ, okay, so there's two discriminations they're already dealing with in their life. And what if they're a minority as well, and poor as well? And so these these discriminations that we see in our culture and in, I guess, most cultures probably that are gendered and racialized and all, are important. We can't look at all victims and all abusers, under the same microscope. To some degree, we can, but their experience is different. And that's why listening to their stories and listening to their voices is so important, and learning from them. That's how, we learn. That's how the power and control wheel was created, was listening to the voices of victims, for example. So all of these kinds of discrimination, citizenship status, think of someone who's an undocumented immigrant. Even how things at politics and how things are done in countries, the issue of corruption, for example, how does that impact a woman's experience? There's a term that's been coined called, I think it's sextortion, and that is when government officials expect bribes from women, and they don't have any money, so they have to pay for it with their body. So the way women's lives are changed and influenced as a result of their social status, their income, their housing affects them. Where do they live? Are they in a safe neighborhood? What's their income? Can they afford to live in a safe neighborhood? What kind of education have they been afforded, and so forth? So all of these multiple marginalities are really important for us to look at when we're addressing victims and perpetrators and working with them, because they are individuals. Even though we know that a lot of the beliefs that abusers have, for example, the superiority, entitlement, the belief they have the right, power, and control, that's shared. A lot of other things aren't shared. So I think we know that in criminal justice, for example, minority victims are more likely to be arrested, for example. So the impact that law, politics, religion, and all of these systems have is really important. And of course, talking about religion primarily today and faith, we need to be thinking about how does that influence and change a victim. And I think a lot of times my experience is I try to talk about this aspect of influence in the sphere of victims, and a lot of people don't want to talk about it. We're not going to talk about religion, don't give me that stuff. But if we ignore these huge cultural and societal influences, then we're not going to understand victims and hear them where they are and be able to reach out to them and provide them with the support they need. So it's very critical that we look at all of these influences, including faith.
Mm-hmm. Ron, did you want to get in on this one?
Yeah, I think Julie's done. Julie did a really good job explaining, I think, this point. The only thing I can't. I'm not adding anything that's different, but I think from our perspective, at least, the reason we want it to be social justice is because if it's left in the mental health field, then it's about taking your medication and going to therapy. Whereas social justice, we acknowledge that this is not an organic issue alone, that there are social, community factors that play into abusive behavior. That also opens the door for us. Our response is more than you need to go see a doctor and get help for this. The response becomes, how are we part of the solution? How are we part of the problem? How are we part of helping? And then I think when it comes, as a faith-based person, when it comes to an ethic, there's an ethic here that it's wrong to oppress other individuals. As Julie mentioned, we have individuals that are facing multiple forms of oppression. And, the ethic is that it's wrong to mistreat, to oppress, to hurt other individuals. And when I have individuals who tell me, I'm abusive because, I have mental illness or PTSD, my take is there's an ethic here, and no child should grow up in a home where he feels afraid or she feels afraid or she feels at risk. And so the ethic is that abuse is wrong regardless of where it comes from. And so you need to be part of a community that's going to help you. So, yeah, I think it has to be a social justice issue so we as a community can work together to deal with it.
Yeah. Thanks, Ron and Julie. I think that this really takes us to the next question, which was the question for Riane, and which I'm going to answer very briefly and share with you some of the resources that are coming your way. And I think, so the question was really about where we are today in the United States. And the question was from Jennifer Kierstead, who says, we are currently experiencing a reassertion of the domination system in US politics, particularly at the national level. A patriarchal type of evangelical top-down thinking is being used to justify this, and would Dr. Eisler speak to this? And so I think this adds just that one more piece on these big picture issues before we move more towards some of the pragmatic sort of how do we work with this kinds of questions that we'll spend most of our time with today. I know that Riane Eisler wanted to share with all of you some answers to this question about what it means to be living at this moment of this reassertion of domination system values, broadly speaking. And I wanted to share with you that we will send all of you Riane's paper called The Integrated Politics of Partnership, the Way Forward for the Progressive Agenda. And here, just in a nutshell, is how I think she would like for us to think about this. Essentially, her thinking here, or her argument here, is that those who believe, like those currently in power in our national government, who believe that top-down domination systems are not only the only option, you either dominate or you're dominated, but that they are sort of the moral, that there's a naturalness to that, and there's a morality to that. And those who have that belief in domination system values recognize very clearly that the foundational importance of sort of early human relations. So those relationships that happen in our families between women and men and between parents and children, and that those folks on the domination system who are advocates for domination system and who are invested in that system of power have done a very concerted job over many years in the face of movements toward partnership, toward a different way of being in relationship with each other that reflects equality and mutual respect. They have reasserted very powerfully domination system values at the level of parenting and household relations. And they understand that how we think about, that the way that we think about the power relationships between men and women and parents and children at home have everything to do with setting the stage for then how that translates into what we view as proper use of power, of what power even looks like, and that it is associated with control and domination and fear and rigid hierarchies of superiors and inferiors. And all of that, and so there's been a concerted effort over many years to shape families and intimate relationships around that dominant, and to sort of reassert that father knows best, father as the master of the house. And in fact, studies have shown that over just a period of 10 years, statistically, the number of people when polled, do you agree that the father is the master of the house? that those numbers went up dramatically over the same period of years, while the forces that have now given rise to our current administration were gathering, right? So what Dr. Eisler wants us all to really understand is that as those of us who are wanting to work for a partnership world as opposed to a domination world, need to make that same connection. That the answer to sort of what do we do at this time is to really go back to this deep understanding that that the values we bring to our family life, to the roles that we take on as women and men, as parents, and in relationship to our children, that making sure that those relationships are seen as absolutely pivotal to the larger picture of the kind of politics that we want, rather than seeing them somehow as separate or just women and children's issues, is really, I think, at the crux of the kind of integrated progressive agenda that Dr. Eisler is calling for, and that is our pathway to partnership as we work in the light of the regressive movements today, which are so adamantly working to reassert the domination system values at the highest levels. So you will all have a copy of Riane's work in this area as part of the follow-up today, but hopefully that gives you just a little flavor of the argument that she wanted to bring forward today to that question. I think we'll go forward and turn now to a whole cluster of questions that we received around how to engage churches and congregations as advocates for a partnership culture. A lot of what we're talking about here is really cultural transformation work, and churches, congregations, faith communities have such an important role to play in that cultural transformation work. So I'm going to just share a cluster of questions, and then Ron, invite you to kind of chime in first on what your experience teaches you about these kind of strategic questions. So these are a cluster of questions around effective strategies for getting churches and congregations to the table. And from Claire Metzger, we heard, how do we get the faith community to the table? pretty direct formulation of it. Lori DiCaprio-Lee asked, how do you convince faith communities that domestic violence is an issue and that they need to address it in their congregations? John Muldoon asks, the denial is so entrenched, it's challenging to overcome. What are strategies for overcoming denial among church leaders? Bonnie Nichols asked, it takes a long time sometimes to develop trust between churches and community resources surrounding domestic violence. How can we build this trust? Are there ways to build trust more quickly? And then finally, Sherelle Thomas asked, I would like to understand how to engage people of different faiths to become committed to changing the culture of domestic violence within their congregations, and how local domestic violence programs can support the change. So Ron, would you like to kind of lead us off in terms of these questions about engagement and specifically sort of engaging through some of the clear barriers of denial or lack of trust that can get in the way of that potentially so powerful positive role that congregations can play?
Yeah, thank you for all of the questions. So I'll try to package this. What we find in working with the what we would call the non-faith-based agencies, state, local government agencies, and I want to add that Lori and I are where we are because so many of those agencies reached out to us, and what the model that we've seen is that the local agencies keep reaching out to the churches, to the faith community, the congregations, the mosques, the other gatherings, groups. A lot of them, if they just keep reaching their hand out, we say that if you keep inviting people to the table, God will always lead somebody there. And there's a story that we tell in Luke chapter 10 where Jesus sends the disciples out and they find a person of peace and stay with them. And we say that when the agencies reach out, God will lead a person of peace to them, and then you develop that relationship. And that person of peace shows up, they hear, they listen, they're moved, always motivated, and somebody somewhere rises up and decides that they want to make it a responsibility to engage faith communities. So the first step then for local agencies to keep reaching out, latch onto that person and encourage them. Other groups would say that sometimes they have to do grassroots programs. There's an individual who doesn't carry a leadership role in their congregation, but maybe there's a group study or a class, and they invite the person from the shelter or the agency to come talk, and then they develop a grassroots movement there. So we find that tends to work well. From the faith community perspective, I try not to be too dismal, but we have a lot we're working against. We have a growing rate of males entering seminary with increasing pornography use. I think, and my colleagues believe that's a big part of domestic and sexual assault. So if you have individuals preaching who regularly look at pornography, don't value women, through the many other areas of their life that they live in, it's going to be very difficult to get them to actually have empathy to help in this area. One thing that happens, and Julie has spoken to this often, is it has to happen to your home. It has to happen to your daughter, your sister, or you have to marry someone. If you're a male leader who's experienced that, or if you're a female leader, your spouse has experienced that in the home. Sometimes when it happens and hits home, then people are willing to listen. So we try to work with clergy when it's happening in their environment. The other way is it has to be taught in the seminary. It has to be taught in the training ground. We've seen it at the seminary where I used to teach. With domestic violence, we saw an increase in students involved and people partnering with agencies. So we need to be catching these young individuals or these second career individuals in the training programs, the schools. So we feel if it happens to you personally, if you're invested, if it happens in your congregation, and it does, but you become aware of it. If we're training people, those are ways to help. I think a fourth point is to understand that trust is very difficult to build, and a lot of my colleagues are just very frustrated and they're discouraged. But once you find that, we say person of peace, and develop a relationship, things begin to change and you begin to see progress, and hopefully that person will stay around. And so those are two things that we found tend to help. The faith community has to ask, what do we bring to the table? And if colleagues invite them to the table and they go through training and listening, a lot of times you'll find those that you'll be able to work with and work well. So those are just some thoughts of what we're trying to be positive of what we're dealing with.
Julie, do you want to add here on engaging congregations?
Well, this is something I've been doing now for almost 30 years, or trying to, and to some degree, they still stay away in droves, but the more I do it, the more I find that the audiences, if you will, are growing. So I think there is a growing awareness. And my experience has been that, as Ron said, a lot of times pastors and faith leaders don't kind of get it until they find out it's happening to somebody they know or are related to or in their congregation. So in hopes that we don't have to wait for that, what I try to do is really put a face on domestic violence, so that if we can get them to a training or some kind of event, I always have a panel of survivors to tell their stories. And I want them to share not only some about the abuse they experienced, but where their faith played a role in it. What did they believe? And how was their faith a part of the problem or a part of the solution, if you will? Were scriptures used against them? Were they in rigid systems that said that you couldn't leave, no such thing as divorce, you have to submit to your husband, that sort of thing? So having those people in the room talking and being willing to speak back, these brave survivors, to talk about their experiences, is, I think, the most powerful possible thing we can do. Getting them in front of faith leaders is something that is a challenge, but once they do, I find that, most faith leaders are people of compassion, and they do what they do because they really want to do the right thing. And so, I've had, for example, victims in churches kind of drag their pastors to conferences or trainings that I did, and it just hit them. They got it, what they had been doing and how they had been mishandling it. And as a result of that, then they asked for help. They asked for us to come in, train our leadership, help us. What do we do? How do we create protocols? How do we have the right kind of response? What do we do to let the victims in our faith community know that we're there for them, that we understand, that we believe them, that we're not going to judge them, and we're not going to, mandate conditions for our help and all of that. So a big part of it, I think, is that faith leaders feel so incompetent around this area that it's not that they don't care, they don't know what to do, they don't know what to say. So sometimes, just kind of like the rest of us bystanders, we just don't do anything. And so if we can educate them, things like the RAVE Project, which is fantastic. I know Kathy Holtman's here from the RAVE Project. I was one of the people that helped work on the development of that website, Religion and Violence e-learning website. It's all free, downloadable information for faith leaders. Having those kinds of things, because they're so busy, things they can access from their office, tools, giving them things like books and podcasts and so forth. Those kinds of things can be really helpful because they can also educate themselves. And I think when pastors say to me that they understand it now, but they didn't understand it before, it's almost always because victims have taught them about it. Mm-hmm. It's not because they read a book so much as it is they've read maybe the stories of victims, and they've seen themselves in them. Yeah.
Julie, I think this really takes us right to the next question, which I'm seeing echoed in the chat right now. So I'll actually share a couple questions for you. One from Krista Lawless, who says, within some churches, so many beliefs are dependent on rigid gender stereotypes and understandings about power relationships between men and women being superior, inferior. She says it is far too threatening to those who are, quote, on top of those hierarchies to allow gender partnership. When victims are told that they are not only going against a man, but also going against God if they question or challenge these beliefs, this adds a layer of fear in victims that does not exist outside of toxic faith systems. What are some ways to help victims in these settings, and how do we possibly engage church leaders who have so much invested in keeping things the way they are and silencing victims? And I'll just add Joy Dearmore's question from the chat just now. She says, faith leaders seldom seem to get it that joint marriage counseling is dangerous where domestic violence is involved, rather often punish the wife for refusing to submit to joint counseling. Can you say your work in terms of supporting victims in these contexts where it's so overdetermined by the existing, by the presence of domination system values at the heart of church structure?
Let me speak to that part, and then Ron can speak to the faith leader question. Because most of my experience is with victims and survivors. And thank you for that question, Joy. I mean, and you're so right about that. I think, the natural instinct for faith leaders or just even secular counselors is to do couples counseling and marriage counseling, which we know is extremely dangerous. It's like the big taboo, really, because of the danger it could cause. But yet that's always seems to be the approach. So for victims, I think so often what I find that their identity is so wrapped up in their religion, especially if they are in a very rigid system and they've grown up in it, that it's such a foreign concept for them to even think that perhaps maybe it doesn't say in the Bible that, all men are supposed to be over all women, that men are not, God doesn't expect men to rule over their wives, because so much of what they've been taught of these man-made interpretations, they've just bought into it to such a degree that really giving that up is like losing themselves. I mean, it's really a process. So I don't challenge them on that immediately. What I want to do is listen to them and hear them and validate them and say, wow, a lot of women tell me this. And, what helped me is I read this book, Questions and Answers for the Abused Christian Woman, Keeping the Faith by Reverend Marie Fortune or something. Here's what helped me, and here's what I've learned. And I speak from my own experience. And there are things that can be done. So many victims are really trapped. I mean, they can't get out and go to a support group, for example, and they're going to be forbidden to go to any of these secular programs, certainly. And because so often there's this disconnect, I wrote a chapter in a book about that, as a matter of fact, between the domestic violence kind of world and the faith arena. They've been at odds for years and years. They don't trust each other. Churches often think that domestic violence shelters and programs break up marriages, and domestic violence programs think that, churches are keeping women trapped in these abusive marriages, and so they don't talk. And what we have to do is we have to talk, we have to partner, we have to educate each other and support each other and help each other. So kind of one of the things I'm doing these days is I'm telling women in these systems that are so rigid about some online support groups that they can do. If they can be safe enough with stalking by technology and, computers and the ways in which abusers can monitor them, if they can get to a safe computer and be at a place where they can use one, there are a lot of options now. Christian support groups, and I'm speaking for the Christian tradition, and I'm sure there are ones, for Muslim and Jewish women and other faith traditions, where they can just go and kind of sit in and listen in. And I see a lot of that happening. I have a Facebook, it's like a private group for people who do Christian ministry and domestic violence. And a lot of them are survivors of domestic violence. And I see them coming and reading the posts and thinking about these articles, and we try to teach each other and share with each other. And so we're going back and forth in discussion, and we're learning from each other. And many of the people in this group who are now doing ministry around violence against women are from some very conservative traditions and some very kind of rigid sects, if you will, of the Christian tradition. Mm-hmm. So, as always, I think it's all about listening to the victim. And the more we build a relationship of trust, and remember, power and control is what they're trying to get away from, as long as we don't try to shove anything down their throat, and we validate them and we listen to them and we understand and don't try to change them, but just try to support them. It's like one of my favorite authors, and I'm trying to remember who it is, says, be the lighthouse. Lighthouses don't go running around an island looking for somebody to shine on, right? You just stand there in the light, and hopefully they'll be drawn to the light, to the truth. So I don't
Yeah.
know how helpful that is, but hopefully. But maybe Ron can speak to the pastoral part of that question. Maybe you can reframe it for him, or it was a long time ago when you asked.
Ron, you want to jump right in, or would it be helpful to?
We're referring to Krista's comment, question.
Yeah, exactly. Around.
Okay. Yes, I remember. I've got it right here.
Yes.
Yeah. So I think Julie brought up some really, really good points. This is really, really difficult, and the women that we have who come to us, who become part of our congregation, who've been in any kind of abusive relationship, faith-based, strict, rigid gender roles, or just a severity is pretty high. It's really hard for them to trust us, just being a congregation that's willing to love them and treat them with respect. And Lori and I, we talk a lot about how it is a brainwashing. It's traumatizing. It runs deep. Just trying to go back to, accepting love from people without any strings attached has been so difficult. And that's how we're supposed to be raised. And if you've been abused in many different ways, in any way, you have to go back to just being loved with, and understanding people can love you without strings attached. And that's so difficult. So when we have individuals who are in congregations who are in that, I don't know that we see it as we're going to be able to get them out, because the whole system is controlling, it's manipulative, it's shaming. Leaving is so difficult. I mean, it's like leaving an abusive home, leaving the congregation. So what we try to do is we just constantly work on safe spaces. We're not here to tell you what to do. We're here to listen. We ask questions. Probably the one that's the most difficult for survivors to answer is, what do you think? Because they've been told so long that what you think doesn't matter, or this is how you think. So we really do a lot of work is, what do you think? The Spirit of God lives within you. How do you feel about this? And that, again, takes a long time to help. So for us, it's really, really difficult, and it takes a long time, and trust and patience, and just, being the person that's willing to say, anytime you want to talk, we're here. We can do what we can with our own boundaries, of course, but we can help you in any way we can, but we're here to listen. Mm-hmm. And sometimes, I wish I could say it always works, but sometimes it works. Sometimes they go back to what's familiar to them, because it's so controlling. Clergy, the male clergy that I've had to work with over the years, basically have a view that feminism is there to take away power. And so, and I think Riane's addressed that so much in her book, that actually sharing power is beneficial to all of us. But a lot of the male clergy feel that feminism, and males in general, feel that feminism means I got to give up something and women are going to take from me. Mm-hmm. So how do you get, leaders with that perspective who are reinforcing, the great evil of feminism, who are trying to reinforce, structure to prevent that? And, one way for us is when they start hearing stories of survivors, I think they need to be traumatized by these stories. And then I think we want to walk with them and say, this is where this thinking takes us. Yelling at your wife and using humiliating language is just as big a sin in God's eyes as physically assaulting, her. Getting them to see that controlling behavior leads to, and I think those few that have been able to take that journey, it's a long journey, but they've had to deal with their own insecurity and their own fear, and their own fear of females, where I think a lot of misogyny comes from. That's been a hard process, but I think that all of it's patience, and we're trying to be prophets and paint a new world of hope. And most of the people we're working with are too afraid to see that.
Mm-hmm.
And so we just keep at it.
I'm really struck by what Julie said about when one is raised in a domination system that is echoed both in your home relationships, your church, what your church is telling you, what you see in the larger culture by having a selective lens on the larger culture. That it becomes not only your identity, which is one big facet, but also is how you know who you are, is your place within that hierarchy. But it also, we know, impacts, and Riane has just written a book on this dimension of how it impacts your brain chemistry. Your whole neurochemical system is wired in response to fear, force, violence at different levels, reacting to those cascades of chemicals that shape really the whole way our brain grows up. So understanding that, I think, really speaks to the kind of patience that you're talking about being such a critical factor here. Brains don't rewire themselves overnight. Identities don't get reshaped overnight. It's by anybody in a domination system, and we know too that the stresses of domination are extreme on the dominators as well as those who are victims of it. It is no one is immune from the negative impacts of these systems, and so patience with those who we think of as benefiting from domination system, but who in fact are subject to this, as you were just saying, the stresses of feeling the need to uphold a sort of power role that is not authentic or based in or grounded in anything real.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we noticed this. Lori and I do a Exodus narrative group for survivors, because Exodus has been approached from African American liberation theology. So we've been doing survivors, and it's interesting when they get to the part where the wandering in the wilderness, and they're afraid and they want to go back home. It's amazing how we're on our fourth cycle of this, but the readers will say, "That was me." And I blamed these. I couldn't understand why they wanted to go back to Egypt, and then we say, well, why did they? And they explain they're familiar, it's safe. And so there's this whole belief that, this system is safer for me than leaving. And that's why when people say, why do they go back? Well, their whole, the brain is wired. They've become dependent. There's a fear level there. And it's amazing how many are reading through this text and saying, that's me, that's how I feel.
Really so profound. And I mean, I think it really speaks to that earlier question about the moment we're in as a nation in terms of this regression. I mean, I think we can see it through that lens as well of tremendous move to try to retreat to something that we imagine felt safe in the past.
And with them, when we get to Exodus 15 and they sing this song after the destruction of the Pharaoh's army, we point out that, the world would never have known this story had they not created a song. And so the world doesn't know your story until you're creating a song. Yeah. And I'm amazed at how many of the women, they left, they carried shame, and they never celebrated. And we say, that's something to celebrate, but they're ashamed of it because, and so they carry that with them. And there's just constant,
I'd like to add a couple of things. One is that I think this is the bonding that abused victims have to their faith and to their religious tradition is very similar to that they have to their abuser. And it's a traumatic kind of a bonding, and yes, they could walk away from it, but what would they lose if they did? A lot of victims get literally excommunicated. They get disfellowshipped. They lose custody of their children because their faith community sides against them and with the abuser to keep the children in that faith tradition, very much like cults operate. And so they have to weigh very carefully. And while we know that leaving is probably the most dangerous thing a victim can do in terms of leaving her abuser, and it takes not only great courage, but hopefully safety planning and, preparation. But leaving her faith community can be equally dangerous. And so one of the things that I like to do is I like to have stories of other victims in that same exact faith tradition. And one of the things I'm trying to work on is a book that tells the stories of different victims, from this denomination and this sect and this one, so that I can say to a woman, here, read this. This is someone who was like you and who you're not the only one. And other people experience it in your faith tradition. And I think with the pastors and the faith leaders, introducing them to someone like Ron, someone who they can relate to, who gets it, who they can go, well, he makes sense. He's somebody who's well educated and, he loves God and he understands the Bible. That influences them more than anything. So it's introducing victims and faith leaders to other people with similar stories. It's very powerful.
Well, I mean, to just combine what the two of you are saying, that combination of the stories of individuals who are making this journey from different traditions, and then having those meta narratives, those bigger stories, which is what religious traditions are meant to give us, right? The bigger stories that say, this is a human story about seeking freedom from oppression.
Oppression, yes.
Human story of and that in that story there are challenges. It's not a seamless leap, right? But that this is all there are narratives within human history that help us to see ourselves as part of a larger drama that's playing out in this shift from domination to partnership, and then these moments of regression back to domination, and the way that fear plays into all of that. Yeah. Should we move to some? There's a few questions that I thought would be important to respond to from Jacqueline Kolnick and from Sarah Butler, around just very specific, tangible things that a church, a church leader, religious leader should take when they learn about violence from partners. What sort of 3 things might you encourage to implement in congregations? And we understand, I think, that when we're talking about cultural transformation and the kind of patience that Ron is calling us to, that sometimes like 3 steps is, it might be sort of important in terms of that initial response, though, even though it's might want to understand as part of something bigger. And then there's a separate question around restorative justice and how the role of that in terms of sexual violence. Julie, do you want to sort of?
Yeah, I love that. And I do think there's 3 things you can do. You believe her, you support her, and you refer her to the experts. This is what I tell everybody to do. Don't feel like you have to be an expert. Now, of course, within the faith tradition, I love what I learned from Reverend Marie Fortune many, many years ago. What are your goals? Your goals need to be stopping the violence, calling the abuser to account, and then third, if that relationship can be restored after the violence has stopped, then helping them work on that. And if that is not possible, then helping them grieve the loss of the relationship and move on is your job as a faith leader. So, and I created some handouts, and I believe I sent them to you, Sarah, that we're going to provide tips for secular advocates working with religious victims, tips for faith leaders working with victims, kind of some do's and don'ts. And then, of course, we've got multiple resources as well. So, I do want people to know that there are things that you can do, but really, truly important, besides safety, which should always be our focus, confidentiality is right up there with it, because it's tied into safety. And our tendency is, a lot of time when we find out that somebody's being abused, we want to talk to somebody else about it. And if you're a pastor or a faith leader, or you run a group in the church, and somebody comes in, you don't want to go to other people there and tell them what's going on, because if the word gets back to that abuser, a couple of things could happen. First, she could get hurt a lot worse because she's let the cat out of the bag. Secondly, then he's humiliated because he's been found out by his faith community. And, he shouldn't be confronted unless she wants you to do it and knows you're going to do it, knows when you're going to do it, because it could be very dangerous. So, there are a lot of kinds of do's and don'ts, if you will. And in terms of restorative justice, a lot of people on this chat may not even know what restorative justice is. And I don't know the official definition, but it's often when a crime victim meets with the perpetrator and they talk and listen, and the perpetrator has to listen to the victim tell, how they were impacted by the abuse. And of course, it's not something that we do a lot in domestic violence, because it's not safe for the victims to do that. But in other sorts of crimes, they do it. And there is kind of a move that way. And I will tell you that I actually did that, but it was many years after my abuse. I found out my abuser was dying in prison, and my son had been 8 months old when I left him, and he had never seen his father again, because he went to prison for attempted murder of me and my pastor father. And when I found out he was dying, I offered my son the opportunity. He was 25 at the time. Do you want to meet your father before he dies? And he hemmed and hawed for a while, months actually, and then finally said yes. And we ended up going to the prison and talking with him. And interestingly enough, it was a very, very transformative experience for all three of us, because not only did he listen about how his actions had impacted us, he actually said, I was mean, I was jealous, it was all me, you were a great wife. And he told his son, don't be like me. I couldn't have scripted it better, but you're not always going to get that. I think it was unusual, but that is restorative justice too. And for me, it was very powerful. The bottom line about restorative justice is it has to be the victim's idea. It has to be something the victim wants, and it has to be done in a safe way. But they also need to, I didn't have anybody helping me with it. I tried to get the chaplain. Nobody would return my calls or reply. Even when I went all the way to Texas from North Carolina, nobody would even meet with me to talk about it. So we just went in there cold to this prison hospice and took a chance. And as it turns out, he had some very spiritual experiences in prison, evidently. He gave us both cross necklaces that he had made, carved out of things. And we walked out of the prison wearing them. And I saw that he had been transformed. And I do believe God had a lot to do with that. That's not to say I would ever be with him, alone again, or I don't know that he was a safe person. It was an artificial environment. But it was a powerful experience. After working for justice for so many years, I was able to actually experience and actually offer mercy and grace, which are so important. And so often as victims, we're so focused on justice that we don't even think about any of that. Mm-hmm. That's very healing for us too, when and if we want it and we're ready for it.
Thank you for sharing that, Julie. It's beautiful.
So Ron, it's your turn, I guess.
The light's on my head because I'm outside, not because I'm saying anything profound.
That's not
God.
We're seeing.
I like those three stages are what we use. I think with ministers, the first one, and I think Nancy Nesson-Clark has done the research that 95% of what the women coming to ask for help want is just a listening ear. And we understand that clergy are some of the more sought out individuals for help.
Yeah.
And we're the least prepared, which is not good. But the first thing that I think, listening, we need to validate those who are survivors. And that does, we see this with our work with racism. I don't know how many white people tell me they think this is all a joke. And we say, go ask your friends who are people of color, and they don't have any. Or they get 10 guys in one, white guys in a room with one guy who's African-American and say, well, are we racist? I mean, we need to validate those who are victims and listen to their story and support them. I think part of that validation is giving individuals vocabulary, and this is really important when we worked with younger ladies to talk about coercion as a form of sexual assault. When they share the story, we'll say, well, we would call that sexual assault. Well, I didn't have any bruises. Well, here's what sexual assault is. So with domestic violence, we want to share, give them a vocabulary. This is domestic violence. This is intimate partner violence.
Like marital rape is another example
yes.
These families, right?
Yes. And they need to know that because they don't have that vocabulary. It gives them a sense of power. And we can, I've written stuff, and I know Peace and Safety in the Christian Home, Nancy and Catherine and Julie have done a lot of writing, but we have scriptures that support all this, and we can use the biblical text to help.
Right.
And then, we want to make sure that they're safe. I've had women come in and say, I thought you were just going to give me a bunch of verses to study, and here you've given me a whole list of people who can help me get out and get in a house. So we want to make sure that they're safe and get them to safety and care for them. If it happens within our congregation, we're going to have to pick one or the other. We can't work with both. If we're going to work with her, she has to be in a community that's safe. If she doesn't feel safe there and she leaves, then we work with him and we hold him accountable. And so I think all of those things that we can do as clergy is to create a safe space for a person to find help. Reconciliation is a hard one, and I trust the colleagues that I work with, even the ones that are not faith-based, they have a desire to help couples reunite if they can. And so they're not out to destroy the family. And so when it comes to reconciliation or reuniting, if that is even possible, I trust them, and we work together with that. I love what Nancy Clark has pointed out, that when you add a faith clergy person into the mix with a batterer, they tend to have a lower rate of repeating the behavior. So if we can walk with people, same things with women who are survivors, if we walk with them and create a safe space, they can grow and be safe. And so those are things that we want to do.
There are some models for faith-based batterer intervention. And, I've always kind of been very leery and suspicious of them because so often, what the faith community has done with abusers is not what needs to be done. It's not about holding them accountable. It's just the opposite. But Changing Men, Changing Lives, that was developed by Ty Schroyer and Barb Jones Schroyer at the Duluth program. If you look that up on your, the internet, Changing Men, Changing Lives, you can learn about it. And there is research that Nancy Clark and Barb Fisher Townsend have done that shows us that in those programs where the faith leader and the judge are part of the accountability of this abuser who has been sent to intervention, there is a greater compliance and completion, at least. So that's what the whole coordinated community response in domestic violence is about. It's about everybody holding this person accountable. If just one person does it, it's not going to work. We all have to be a part of it, but with the victim's permission, we have to do that. So.
Hey, and I think that's, we have ARMS, which is a great faith-based resource here. But I know as a minister, I work with all the batterer groups, and I have a relationship with them. And I think the one thing we try, I have guys will say, I don't want to go there. And so why not? Oh, because they cuss. And it's like, that's the least of your problem. But a lot of guys are trying to use faith-based as a way of getting out of getting help. And
They're like conscientious objectors.
Yeah. We just require they go, and then I have a relationship, and I know the providers are not going to do anything that would undercut what we're trying to do as a church. And I think one of the comments on here, we're not mentioning the children. And
yeah, I was just gonna kind of steer us in that direction.
Yeah, I wanted to say that another reason that clergy have to be involved in this is because children are affected, and you'll find that with the youth workers, the ones who work with kids. They'll see that something's up, and kids are really, there's a helicopter. Kids are really struggling with this. It's damaging them emotionally, physically. It's damaging them spiritually, and it's also the fathers are giving them a role model that they don't want to repeat when they get older.
That's why the domination system versus partnership is so damaging, because when that kind of power and control is seen as inevitable, as normal, as desirable, children are punished, and children are and they're treated as little, possessions, and they don't have self-determination, and that's why so often we have to talk about the whole spare the rod, spoil the child thing in my faith, Christianity, because there are so many traditions that teach that you don't really love your children unless you are physically disciplining them. And so I speak a lot to victims about this and say, the word discipline comes from the Greek word that means to teach. Hitting children is not teaching them, it's punishing them. And, and we go back to the whole shepherd story. The rod is an instrument that was used to throw in the direction of a wayward sheep to get their attention and to get them to come back to the flock. It wasn't something that was used to hit the sheep. So a lot of times we take scriptures that are well known and we help them understand what they really are saying and how they've been twisted by these domination-based religious groups, and they've been misinterpreted and taught all of these years. So, and children, growing up in domestic violence, children are resilient, but we know from the ACEs study and from all the work we know about trauma and PTSD, that children who are exposed to violence, they are at risk for all kinds of health problems and shorter lifespan and all kinds of stuff. But the greatest negative impact on children that grow up in domestic violence is how their relationship with their protective parent, usually their mother, is destroyed and undermined by the abuser. And we know this because of Lundy Bancroft's work. If you haven't read his book, Why Does He Do That? And The Batterer's Parent, that's very, very helpful. So it's not just that they see violence or that they hear violence, it's what they're learning, and it's perpetuating that domination model. And as I said in the last webinar, until we stop raising batterers, we're never going to stop domestic violence. And the only way we can do that is by shifting the paradigm from domination to partnership.
And one thing that we don't, in addition to what Julie's pointing out, is in faith communities, there's this myth of the single parent home is the worst place for a kid. And this is where a lot of the women we've worked with won't leave because they don't want their kids to grow up in single parent homes. And really that, Lundy Bancroft points out that research is used against women, not against men, male single parents. But, we have to point out that, 1 Corinthians 7, God has called us to peace. Shalom Bayit, as the Jewish community calls it. The home is to be a place of peace. And if one partner is bringing in violence and manipulation and control, that is not a place of peace. And it's important for kids to be in a home of peace because as adults, Juan Carlos Riane has pointed out that the majority of kids brought up in abusive homes don't abuse. But I think we begin to see that they abuse themselves. And we have a lot of adults that we work with that are They have a lot of at-risk behaviors. They have a lot of emotional struggles because they grew up in a home where they witnessed abuse.
Mm-hmm.
And so just because a person doesn't physically marry someone and become physically abusive, or marry a person who's abusive to them, they have other ways that they are emotionally unhealthy that hurts them. And so we should, faith communities, if anything, should be alarmed at this, that we want those kids in a safe place. We want them to be at peace and to be calm.
And I think it's really important. Something you said reminded me, Ron, that it's extremely important that faith leaders and those working in the religious community know that we don't want to wait until someone's been hit. Hitting is not, domestic violence is about coercive control. It's not just about what an abuser does to a victim. It's the freedoms they remove from them. It's the way in which they take over their life, and the victim is living under siege without any freedoms, having things removed from them, like their ability to go where they want to go, talk to who they want to talk to, wear what they want to wear, work, go to school, drive, so it's so much more. And there may not be any hitting going on in the home, but what the children are learning is that it is men's role to control women and to make the choices for their lives. And this is the microcosm of the dominator culture. On the big scale, we see this in religion with ISIS, for example, with Boko Haram, the way they look at women and girls. We saw it in the secular world with the Nazis. This domination, the power is all here, and the people with the power, without the power, are right here. And that's why in the last webinar I showed you the equality wheel, which is the opposite of the power and control wheel picture of domestic violence. Because the opposite of domestic violence is not nonviolence, it's equality. And in order to have equality, in this country, women don't even have equality under the law yet. We have 37 states that have ratified the Equal Rights Amendment, and we need one more. North Carolina, my state, may become it. We hope it will. But, we know that even though laws can't change culture and paradigms, they are important. We know, as Riane has said many times, the lawsuit that went to the Supreme Court changed segregation in the schools. It is powerful. So we do need, and the things that we need to be working towards are things that will bring about equality, things that will reframe violence against women and domestic violence as human rights violations, as torture even. Mm-hmm. Just this week, in fact, I think it was yesterday or today, I read an article about, I read an article today, I think it was in Newsweek, that said that the United States is one of the 10 most dangerous countries for women in the world. It ranks third with Syria. It's shocking. It's outrageous. And to think that we, are this supposedly, sophisticated Western nation and don't even give all of our citizens equal rights. It's unbelievable, isn't it? But there's a reason for that. There is a reason for that. It's because sharing power is very threatening to the powers that be. And that's why feminism is so mistrusted by the powers that be, including the religious powers that be.
Yeah. And also why recasting some of the conversation using language like partnership, like equality,
yep.
Can also be a part of that shift in terms of giving people language to talk about the kind of relationships that we're hoping, that we're aiming for, that are healthy and supportive of life. That those relationships are not are beneficial to all human beings, And I think where Riane Eisler's work also helps us is to understand that there are times and places in human history where such cultures have existed. You know,
Yes.
we have record that this is not a pipe dream or a utopian fantasy, that there are cultures and there are microcultures all around our own country where partnership is very much the norm. But we're not, but as we've seen, these dynamics of domination are still very, very much at the legacy of that is very much alive in the United States, and really helps us to see the connections between these issues of what's going on in our own families, what's going on with our policies that don't support families. And then what's going on in the way that we think about everything from immigrants to people of other races to, all of that is part of this same structure of these hierarchies of ranked relationships. I thought we might close with inviting you both to reflect on a beautiful question from Luana Neri, who really was looking for some inspiration and insight from you both around. Her question was, what do you tell yourself regarding how slow things are changing? And how do you keep hopeful? Part of, I think, the challenge for all people doing work toward partnership is that it's never done. That you don't, that there's no end. It's a cultural transformation work is ongoing work, and it doesn't, and regressions happen, and so what is it that you each how do you talk with yourself in your own mind, in your own heart, about how you stay hopeful and what fuels your ongoing labors to make things better? Ron, maybe we'll start with you.
Yeah, my colleagues with the homeless work always laugh when I always quote Jesus. The poor you'll always have among you, and you can do with them as you wish, and or when we're doing with domestic violence mission statements, and they'll talk about eradicating sexual assault. And I'll just say, I believe that evil always exists, and so we'll always have this issue. So it's forced us to celebrate the small victories, to realize that we're trying to change a whole culture, and we can't do that alone. And so when we celebrate victories with a lot of the people we work with, and we do a lot of encouraging, because one of us is always down, and so the group tends to build the other up. I think that's it. This is a long haul. We'll die with a lot of work to do. And, the best thing we can do is just celebrate those victories with the community, make sure we're not doing this alone. And the more advocates that we have with us, the more growth we'll begin to see. And other people tend to point us to the change that's happening. And so when we feel down and feel pretty discouraged, somebody else says, well, look at what's happening. And, that's what keeps us going, I think.
Julie? Oh, don't forget to unmute yourself, Julie.
I was going to say that was really well said. I do get discouraged sometimes. I feel like we're going backwards, but overall, I do have hope. And thanks for asking the question, Luana. Luana Neri was my support group facilitator when I had just been abused, and I showed up, and I didn't even understand that I had been a battered woman because I hadn't been getting beat up. And she's the one who taught me, and this is a long time ago. And well, people like Luana give me hope. People who are standing in the light. I think there are more of us all the time. And I see I see shifts taking place in society. The Me Too movement and the Time's Up movement and the Church Too movement. Those give me hope. I see victims and survivors being emboldened and having the courage to speak up, to demand justice. We saw what happened with the Olympic gymnasts, how brave they were, and all of the women who came forward against Harvey Weinstein, and just this week how University of North Carolina was found guilty essentially of violating the rights of the victims of sexual assault by not handling it properly. So we're making progress, and there's always going to be a pushback when progress is being made and change is being made, and we're trying to tip this paradigm. We're trying to tip it from domination to partnership, and we're getting a lot of pushback, and that's normal and that's natural. But I think of how far we've come since I started in this business. My domestic violence experience was in 1989. We didn't have a Violence Against Women Act that funded any programs in the United States at that time. We didn't have any laws really against domestic violence. We didn't have protective order laws. We didn't have any of the stuff we have now with the Victims of Crime Act money. So much, we have come so far in such a short time. I think about it, shelters were here and there throughout history, but the real domestic violence shelter, the first one that we know of that started in the world, was 1970. Look how far we've come. So that gives me hope. I think we're going to move faster and faster towards that tipping point, and we just have to keep kind of the pressure on. And it's going to take a lot of boldness, a lot of courage, a lot of not being bystanders, as we talked about last time, speaking up, taking a stand. Silence is the voice of complicity. And the more we share with others who are in this same space, who believe the same thing we do, who believe that there's more for humanity, that we're better than this. We can do this. We cannot give up. We have to keep fighting. We'll be exhausted, we'll be tired, we'll be old, but it's a process, not an event. And to be part of the process is an honor and a privilege. And I have hope from all of the many people who are working on it alongside me, and all of you out there who are learning and reaching and being a part of it wherever you are all over the world. Thank you.
That's just beautiful, Julie. Thank you so much. And thank you, Ron. I am reminded of a little story I just read about the way in which in a choir, when you're singing together, that when one person needs to take a breath, that breath is staggered across the chorus in order that the sound can be continuous while each person has that moment to take a breath and replenish themselves. And I think that's a piece of this, that if we think about all of our voices being part of that song, and that each of us has the right and the privilege to be the one taking the breath while someone else is singing at that moment, and allow ourselves to work together as a chorus in that way, that's a big piece of that understanding, that just as the victims are not alone, that and survivors are not alone, that none of us are alone, that we are working as part of a partnership movement, and together our song is louder and louder.
Yes.
I want to thank you again so much for all you've shared with us and taught us today, Julie and Ron. Thanks to Anne, who has been populating our chat box with wonderful links and resources and responses to people's questions. Thank you so much, Anne, for all your work also in terms of the promotion and marketing of this webinar. A final shout out to all of our co-sponsoring organizations. Thank you so much for sharing the news about this webinar, and also as we provide you with the follow-up email, including a link to this session today, as well as the prior webinar and all the other kinds of resources, some of which Julie mentioned, those I've mentioned, Ron's mentioned. We look forward to our co-sponsoring our organizations also being able to share those with your communities that you serve and support. So with that, we will close for today. Thank you for the lively conversation in the chat, to those of you who have stayed with us. And we look forward to whatever future conversations may emerge as we take the time to study the next round of comments and questions and give some reflection to where we might go next with these important conversations. So thank you all for your work and for being with us today. Well,
thank you for moderating. And thank you, Center for Partnership Studies, for inviting us. It was a real honor to do this. It's wonderful to work with you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anne and Sarah and Julie. And this has been a great workshop. I mean, great webinar.
Yes, indeed. Oh, and thanks to Donna for her live tweeting as we've been chatting. She's been tweeting, and we appreciate that. Be well, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.